Hello and welcome back to the Downforce Debrief podcast. Once again, joined by Phil. And in this episode, we are talking about next year's both F1 and MotoGP, as well as the 2027 rule change for MotoGP. So all about the future in this podcast. So let's start with next year. Let's get straight in there then. F1 2026. Of course, we've got the big rules overhaul. And I've been looking into these rules quite a bit recently. A chassis and rule change, quite a rare one. But yeah, I guess I just quickly go through what is changing. So first of all, on the chassis side, you've got lighter cars, you've got active aero, which is going to work a little bit like DRS, except for you don't need to be within a second of the car in front. You will just activate that in certain zones. So you'll get less downforce on the front and rear wings. And then also, of course, the engine, big changes. So the combustion engine itself is largely staying the same. It's moving to more sustainable fuels and it's limited on power to 400 kilowatts. The MGU-H is going to be gotten rid of. That's the one that used to run off the turbo. So that one's completely gone now. But they've upped the MGU-K power up to 350 kilowatts, up from 120 kilowatts previously. So that's pretty much tripled in power. Now, they're calling it a 50-50 split between combustion and hybrid, or combustion and electrical energy, which is close to the truth. It's 350 kilowatts versus 400, pretty close to the truth. But yeah, so I mean, the big challenge is going to be recharging. Apparently, they could get through with 70 kilos of fuel next year, but they're going to be running 100 kilos of fuel just to recharge the battery. So 30 kilos of fuel per race just to try and recharge the hybrid systems, which is pretty crazy. So that's a sort of overhaul, or overview rather, of what we're going to see next year. Phil, what are your thoughts on these upcoming regulations for next year in F1?
Well, I'm most interested in what the drivers make of it, because I remember when the first vision for this rule change came in, a lot of the drivers were pretty down on it, and were particularly Max Verstappen. And I think this was when Verstappen was still in like winning everything mode, right? You know, a season and a half ago. He didn't mince his words and said that, you know, it would ruin the sport, the cars would be undrivable, everything would be rubbish, and there's no point. So to what extent have those rules changed, if any, and how do the drivers feel about them now?
Yeah, I feel like there's a current dominating driver that always say that about rules. Like, they don't want it to change. They're loving life right now. So, I don't know. I think it's going to be really interesting. So I made a mod for the F1 game and I tried this. And it's not perfect because it's a game. And obviously I made it. It may not be quite accurate. But certain things I was able to get quite accurate, which is that it takes 11 seconds to fully either recharge or deploy the battery, because you're limited to 350 kilowatts of power. That's in or out of the battery. That's obviously 11 seconds. You can definitely deploy the entire battery in a straight. But more importantly, the recharge. So it takes 11 seconds to recharge it. Now, I heard James Vowles say recently, the team principal Williams, that you can apparently completely recharge the battery in one braking zone. Now, that is a lie, because there's no braking zones in F1 that are 11 seconds long. That is... Well, it's probably an exaggeration. I suspect what we're going to see is a bit of recharge at the end of the straight for, you know, maybe 1 or 2 seconds, plus maybe a 3 or 4 second braking zone. And then you'll also charge it mid-corner by sort of revving the engine higher than it normally would be mid-corner. I still don't think we'll see the battery fully recharged in one braking zone / one corner. But I think that was a bit of a bait to his rivals, but it's literally physically impossible in the rules to recharge faster than 11 seconds, the battery from 0 to 100. So it's going to be really tactical. There's going to be some tracks that it's going to be like impossible to charge because there's not enough braking zones and there's not enough parts where your corners where you're partial throttle. So that's going to be the big war, I think, for next year. Is going to be how quickly can you recharge that battery? What kind of systems have you got to be able to recharge it? I think it's going to become a bit like the exhaust blown diffusers we saw in 2011, where you sort of... I'm still not clear. I've literally... I'm proper nerded out on this. I've literally looked at the actual regulations and like worked it all out and stuff. I'm still not clear whether the driver himself has to be partly on the throttle in order for it to be revving and generating mid-corner, or if the engine does it itself. So that could be a crucial one potentially. You might have to change your driving style. So it's gonna be really interesting. And I want to say, I'm actually, having looked into it now, I'm quite excited for it, because I think it's going to become really tactical in terms of the smartest driver that can recharge the battery the best while not losing too much time to the car in front is going to be much quicker. Because if you've got, you know, even if you can only recharge an extra, I can't remember what the limit is, no, it's like 11 megajoules per lap, I think, is what you can recharge. So if you can recharge like 1 megajoule more than your rival, that's going to be a massive advantage. So, James, another thing, sorry, I'm waffling here. There's so much in my brain about all this stuff. James Vowles also said that apparently the overtaking is going to be very different. So where previously most of the overtakes were at the end of straights, that's still possible now, because if you're within a second of the car in front, you can use more power, but obviously you're still limited by the amount of energy you've got. But it'll mean things like if someone's low on battery, it might be somewhere we never normally see overtakes. But if you can deploy that extra 350 kilowatts of power while the other guy's got no battery, you will just fly past them like they're stood still. So that's why it's going to be super tactical. I think we're going to see a lot more overtaking, but it's going to be very different overtaking. Very much like a car stood still, you just fly past. And I'm excited for it, especially at the beginning when we're going to see, the teams and drivers not having mastered it yet. We're going to see a lot of variety and a lot of crazy overtakes, I think. But then obviously once it settles down, they'll all start getting similar. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much of this you knew, Phil, beforehand, or what I've just waffled on there. But how did that sound to you? How do you think it's going to be next year, racing-wise and I guess spectacle-wise?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think, spectacle is the big issue with that. You look back to the golden era of F1. Maybe some people would call that like the late 80s, early 90s, right? With, Senna and Mansell and Prost banging wheels together. The car that got to the front was the driver that was driving their car the fastest, right? And, obviously there was a huge mechanical advantage for the car that had been designed advantageously as well. But you could tell what the drivers were doing. They were braking a bit later and they were getting on the throttle a little bit earlier out of the corners because their car allowed them to do so. I think the problem for a lot of fans in modern F1 is that it's not clear how clever the drivers are being at marshalling their resources in order to defend a position or to spend 5 or 6 laps teeing up an overtake. If you're really, really engaged to the level you've just described, plus you have all the overlay telling you what's going on with people's batteries, you can go, oh, he's actually been really, really sly about this, and you can appreciate it. But it does take a lot of effort on your part to understand why some drivers have more pace at certain phases of the race. So my concern by the way that you've described these rule changes is this going to make it easier to understand when drivers are being very clever with their resources, or is it going to make it even more impenetrable for a casual fan?
It's a really good point. I think the on-screen display is going to be absolutely critical, isn't it? Because I think even if all we have is like a little percentage charge or something for each driver's battery, that would be enough. So like you said, you could see that they're both on 0, and then you see the car behind gets to 100 while the other guy's only on 50. You'd be like, oh, hang on, there's an overtake coming. Like you said, you could appreciate the skill there more. Because I think it's, like I said, I think it's going to be really interesting and really tactical. But if you can't see that clearly, which of course you can't see a battery charge, whereas like you said, the good old days, as it were, it was all so simple that you could see someone get on throttle early, you could see them sliding, you could see them pushing, whereas you can't see someone cleverly recharging a battery. So let's hope that they've got some sort of good overlay lined up for next year, because I do think it's going to be critical. But we do also know that F1 tends to be quite late with their overlays for the season. They tend to start the season, don't they, with an overlay that maybe doesn't quite work how it's supposed to, and then a couple of races in, they fix it. So hopefully they're on it. I'm sure they are, because it's a huge change. But I'm quite excited for it. I'm ready for it. I like the active aero side. I think that's a smart solution, even if it's not for overtaking. I think it's been crazy that we've outlawed active aero in F1 for so long, honestly. In F1, I think, we had so much crazy active aero and active suspension in the past, or active suspension more so. I think it's crazy that we just choose not to use that technology these days, especially when road cars are getting more active suspension and stuff. I think it's a bit of a weird omission. So active aero, I think, is going to be good. But yeah, I think we'll see. But I guess more importantly is what is the form book going to look like? With both chassis and engine regulations changing, who's going to come out on top? It is going to go down to the drivers, I think, a bit more. But at the end of the day, whoever's got the most downforce is probably still going to be the quickest and the most power, or not the most power, but the most harvesting, the most efficient engine. So, God, Phil, hit us. Who's going to be Constructors' World Champion in F1 2026?
Williams F1 team. James Vowles.
Boom.
Okay. Do you know what? That would be nice, wouldn't it? I think we're sort of overdue like a massive form tipping set of regs. It was probably 2010 was the last really dramatic one, or maybe the beginning of the ground effect era.
Well, the hybrid era was a pretty big change.
Yeah, I suppose. So I think I was just particularly gutted when Ferrari, went from Massa having essentially won that championship in 2008 to just being nowhere in 2009.
Controversial with the current court case you got going on.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there as well.
How old does he look these days, by the way? I think nice and simple. Give that one to Massa, and then give 2021 to Lewis Hamilton. So Hamilton's got no loss of stats, and then justice prevails. But I think it's been too long since we've had a really dramatic one that's like completely sent the midfield to the front and sent the established teams to the back. It would be lovely if that's what's happened this time. There's something about the way that Williams have built with James Vowles that makes me think that maybe they're among the best positioned to really take an advantage. Their process has been all about, like, when he took over, they were nowhere. So he came in and said, right, we've got nothing to lose. So you might as well break everything and then figure out the best way of rebuilding it. If we finish 19th and 20th because you've thrown out all the previous systems, that's fine because we were going to finish 19th and 20th anyway. And year on year, the improvement that they've seen, and part of that, they've been flattered by having Carlos Sainz in the car this year. I still think year on year, they've been really impressive in how they've worked their way back up the grid. And of course, everybody, knew that these regs were coming in for the last few seasons and have been spending accordingly. It would be quite cool to see someone like Williams. I would rather that than Aston Martin. I think they would be the other team that you'd say they've got the ambition, the spend, and the personnel. Most recently to really make a big push when there's rule changes. But it feels sort of cynical. The Stroll thing, it's not a romantic story if Aston Martin become the next team to beat.
It's not a team most people want to cheer for, is it? For the best one in the world.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised. I don't see a lot of, were it not for Alonso, what sort of like romantic equity does that team have? It is so cynical and corporate and nasty.
Yeah, I mean, Aston Martin obviously is a loved brand. That Silverstone outfit under Force India Guide, always good bang for your buck. But I do agree, like, who's cheering for the billionaires these days? Unless you happen to be a Muscite, not really. So I wish I could disagree with you, but unfortunately, I agree. I think Williams, I think they're cooking. I really like James Vowles. I was exposed to him a little bit when he was at Mercedes, but not by that much. But as a team principal at Williams, I've been really impressed with him. I thought he's just gone about it in the right way. He's been really open and honest about everything. As you said, like, he inherited quite a bad team, so let's just try some stuff. And they've already made some good steps forward. I think, though, more importantly, is going to be looking at who's given up earliest this year. So, like you rightly mentioned, that Aston Martin, I think it's pretty clear they gave up pretty much before the season even started, because they know they've got Adrian Newey who's working on next year's car. It's all about next year. They almost gave up on this year before it started. So Aston Martin, with their new facilities, with Adrian Newey, with Alonso in the car, with all the money that the billionaire gives, I think they are a good shout. I do think Williams as well, because again, they're looking for a reset. But the thing is, most teams are the same. I doubt any team really was developing past like sort of May time this year or something crazy. Do you know what I mean? Like, the one exception to that, on the other end of the spectrum, I think is Red Bull. They're still bringing upgrades even now. Like in the last race, they brought upgrades, which is crazy. And to me, that says a lot about their engine, is that they're running Red Bull powertrains next season. And I reckon they identified, we're in trouble. Like, we are a way off Mercedes. It's going to be a bad couple of years. So in which case, let's win the driver's title this year, because Constructors is in the mud. That's the only explanation for it. I don't see why they would be still developing this year's car. They keep coming out and saying, we're still valuing developing this year's car, but there's not. There's just not. Like, whereas McLaren as well switched off their development very early with how dominant they've been, clearly. Ferrari, I think, under Fred Vasseur, they've done the same thing. So there's a lot of teams there that have switched off development very early to concentrate on next year. And I think, like I said, the only standout ones, Aston Martin, maybe Williams, but they've also had a decent season, so maybe they've developed too much. Aston Martin on the one end, and then Red Bull on the opposite end of the spectrum. I think they're the only two potential standouts that I can clearly see. But there's, as always with these rules, there's a scope for anyone to fly up the order. So, yeah, I'm excited for it. Do you agree on Red Bull, or do you think they'll Red Bull it and still be at the front anyway? With Max, of course.
They have been caught out in the past. There have been, during the Vettel years, they seemed pretty much impossible to topple, and were toppled. And it took them a long time, and it was about the engine. So, yeah, it's a huge risk to go for, what they've done with their own powertrain next season. Unfortunately, it's not very dramatic, but I think I agree. I can't see them holding this performance level. And realistically, Max is flattering the car even this season. The performance is probably more like the way Liam Lawson and Yuki Tsunoda have driven the car. So throw an absolutely newborn powertrain into that equation, and you're looking at cars that will probably struggle to get in the points. Maybe that's a bit of wishful thinking, because I want that churn, I want the drama, I want the stories, and I'd also love to see Ferrari manage to get their ducks in a row again, because I think it would just be very romantic and good for the sport, and I'd quite like to see Lewis Hamilton have at least a fighting chance of pushing for a title. Likewise, Charles Leclerc, he deserves a bit of a shot at it by this point, doesn't he? But yeah, there's not really any great indication that they're massively confident about next year.
Which is probably good, because I think Red Bull are the most recent team to have dominated. McLaren obviously dominant at the moment, but as of right now, neither of their drivers are world champions. So I think if they do well, it's not the end of the world. As much as we don't want a McLaren dominant era, whereas Red Bull were very dominant for only a couple of years, but were very dominant, very, very boring, because it was only one driver as well. Mercedes, obviously, they've got two drivers now who have also never won championships. I agree, the romantic story of Ferrari, either Leclerc or Hamilton getting a record-breaking 8th title, having moved to a new team, that would be amazing in red as well. I think, I'm not a Red Bull hater, I promise. I was never a big Christian Horner fan, but I'm not a Red Bull hater. But I do think anyone but Red Bull, I think, would make for a good season. So, but I guess time will tell. Time will tell on that one. But the other thing they're talking about for next season is mandatory 2 stops. Now, I don't think they've detailed exactly how this would work, but I assume it would be you've got to use all 3 tyre compounds, soft, medium, and hard throughout the race. Now, obviously, this didn't work too well in Monaco when they tried it earlier in the year, but Monaco's Monaco. However, I do think that if there's an unusable tyre, let's say the hard tyre is virtually unusable because it's just too slow and whatever, I think they'll still do a 1-stop soft medium and then just pit in the last few laps for a set of hards because the hards are bad. I think we'll get that a lot of races if they just artificially force them to run all 3. If they just say everyone's got a 2-stop, it's still a bit artificial, but at least we could see like a soft medium. It's difficult, isn't it? Because I'd still like to see the Pirelli tyres wear enough that they're forced to stop. I think that's a much more natural way of doing it. Even if you were artificially making bad tyres, the end result is still quite natural. I think if we have the same tyres, I don't know if a mandatory 2-stop would work. I'm a huge fan of 2-stop races, but the tyres as they are, I don't think that rule would add anything. What do you think, Phil?
What's the point? I
let's just end the podcast. That's I'm going home and sit. I'm going to bed. What's the point?
I agree that back in the days when a 2-stop was viable, great. And to be honest, I'm also thinking of the days when refueling was allowed. So you saw a much greater variance of strategies across the grid in one particular race. So that meant, those 2 variables together would make a 2-stop not only viable but basically necessary, because they were just gunning it for the entire race distance. At the moment, the race is so much about careful management in the first place that I just don't really see the point. It seems like quite an artificial way to try and introduce more varied strategies and teams rolling the dice, and there being some spectacular story of somebody who's just nursed their tyres to the end and then take a massive advantage by just absolutely caning their softs on the last stint. But it doesn't feel like that's realistic, and it doesn't feel like just there's not enough. There needs to be a huge systemic change to make people incentivize broader variants of tactics. To me, I could be missing something there, but I'm not sure what the point is of making that rule.
I do agree, to be honest. I also think we don't need it next year. We've got such a huge regulation change coming. Like, we don't need to this year, maybe. Certainly when you got a dominant team, but I feel like we just don't need it next year. So let's hope that doesn't happen. I don't, because you made a good point about the 1-stop. I love seeing, I always go back to like Sergio Perez back in the day nursing. I think in Spa, maybe was it in a Force India? He nursed a 1-stop or something, and then gets a great result from it. Fantastic! That's a great story. I love that. I also love that MotoGP, which we'll talk about in a minute. I don't want to go too deep into MotoGP just yet. I love that MotoGP also has tyre saving, because obviously you don't pit in MotoGP, it just takes too long. So I love that we see that. You see always someone nurse their tyres, and sometimes you get someone coming back massively fast at the end. Is it Anea, who's the
Yeah.
is it Anea that's incredible with his tyres? Yeah,
Bastianini's always amazing in the last 3 or 4 laps. Just comes
Exactly.
from absolutely nowhere. Yeah.
exactly. Or sometimes you get someone who runs away with the race and then suddenly their tyres die. Like, it doesn't happen as much anymore, but we have seen it quite a bit in the last couple of years. So, like, I love that. So I do like the tyre strategy side of it. I just think, yeah, I agree. The force of the two-stop, I don't think would work in my opinion. But just before we move on to MotoGP then, what about F2? F2, this is something you want to speak about, Phil. You think F2 is maybe not as useful as a feeder series as it once was?
I just wonder if it's a bit of a poison chalice to win that F2 championship now. It used to be seen as the golden ticket to get into F1. You win that F2 championship, then of course you will get a drive and probably quite a good team. There was a lot of prestige to it. I don't think the prestige necessarily of that accomplishment in the series has diminished at all. I get the sense that actually viewership is really strong. It's benefited from, the races being whacked onto YouTube. It's easier than ever to follow F2. I think the problem is the F1 grid is a bit more stagnant from year to year than ever. There are fewer teams than there were 25 years ago, and you can't stay in F2 once you've won it. So if you're in that position as the champion, then if you don't manage to broker a deal to an F1 team because there aren't any seats available, just off to Super Formula or something, or do DTM for a few years, and your stock is kind of through no fault of your own diminishing as that goes on. So I wanted to get your take on what's the value of winning the F2 Championship at the moment, and is it a bit of a poison chalice?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think you mentioned like DTM and stuff. I think Formula E or WEC is also another common ground for those guys to go to. While you were talking now, I just looked up the champions of F2. So I'll run from 2017, which is when it became F2, it was GP2 before that. So just from 2017, these are the champions by year. Charles Leclerc, George Russell, Nick De Vries, Mick Schumacher, Oscar Piastri. Right, that's up to 2021. So pretty decent. Like we know all these people. They've been in F1. It's varying levels of success, but there's some very decent drivers there. However, since 2022, you got Felipe Drugovich, Teo Porcher, and Gabriel Bortoleto. And obviously, Bortoleto has made it to F1, and is actually I've been quite impressed with him. Actually, I think he's doing very, very well. But definitely the previous two, Drugovich and Porcher, definitely haven't really done it. But more interestingly, on this wiki article here, we've got a percentage of the points achieved. So obviously the number of races varies and stuff. So again, you got Leclerc, he got 53% of the points possible in the season that he won. Russell, 49%. De Vries, 50%. Mick Schumacher only got 37%. And I feel like we can probably agree that Mick Schumacher maybe isn't certainly not a Max Verstappen level driver, put it that way.
Yep.
But he's definitely less, so that's telling. Although interesting that Nick De Vries managed to level both Leclerc and Russell. Then you've got Piastri, who got 51%, so back up to those other guys' level. Drugovich, 48%, so not that much behind. But then you go down the last two, Porcher, 41%, and Bortoleto, 40%. The reason I bring up those numbers is because I wonder if it just so happens to be that the last couple of years we haven't had a star in F2, and that's why it's become a bit of a poison chalice, as you put it, because there's not been a Charles Leclerc or George Russell level driver that's come through and the teams have gone, we need to snap this guy up. He might be the next Max Verstappen, which at the end of the day is all what the teams are looking for. Everyone's looking for the next Max Verstappen. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, interestingly, I don't watch F2 anymore. I used to, but I don't anymore. And I feel like I need a personality to get into. But I also don't watch Moto2 and Moto3, which I know you do. I don't know. I don't know what it is about it. I watched it up to the point where they started doing 3 races per race weekend, and I went, that's too much. I'm out, and literally just stopped immediately watching it, and I've never got back into it since. So whether that's telling or not, I don't know.
I think star factor is a part of it for sure. I also find it difficult to latch on to storylines. I very much enjoyed it when who was the British driver, Dan with the temper,
Dan Ticktum.
Yeah. His is an unfortunate story. You don't really like to see anybody self-sabotage away their chance at F1. But stories like his made it very, very watchable, and they don't seem to have surfaced in recent years. I also think it's a bit of a shame that there's no place for like the older rookie. Like Damon Hill, when he came into Formula 1, was about 57 years old. It was insane. that's basically impossible these days because, as you say, everyone is looking for Max Verstappen. They want to, be able to pay that driver on a teenager's salary for a couple of years. Like, I don't know how accurate it was, but I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, all the driver salaries leaked. It was during Lando's rookie year when he was teammates with Carlos. Carlos was earning somewhere between 10 and 20 million. And Lando's salary was sub 1 million. So that must be a part of their motivation as well for trying to snap somebody up young. Having a Lando Norris tier driver for less than $1 million a year for maybe 1 to 2 years of their career.
I don't know if that's true. I think it's not the F1 manager game. I think with the budget cap these days, I think they've got plenty of money to pay a driver. They obviously don't want to pay a rookie driver 10 million a year either, but I don't think that's a big concern. I think they want the personality that's going to sell their brand and their sponsors well, and obviously a rapid driver. They want a combo of those two. Priority on the driver, but equally they can't allow a driver that's going to be swearing and mouthing off all the time and cursing out the sponsors. Do you know what I mean? They're a business. They just cannot have that. So that's there's a minimum level required of being media trained and being have that personality, and then obviously the rest of it's about driving. So I don't think money's a big thing. Certainly not for the bigger teams. Okay, as a business, if you can save 10 million a year, save 10 million a year, but they'll make way more than that if they've got a guy there that's very good driver with a very good personality. Like the value of someone like Daniel Ricciardo, having him in your team is super high. Clearly, the fact that he ended up retiring, it shows that it's not just about personality. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I think you're right about the star quality. I think for F2, for any driver to thrive, they need that star quality. They need to stand out from the crowd. Otherwise, you get someone like Bortoletto or somebody coming through and doing well, but they're not like the next big thing. You need that person to stand out in some way, whether it's personality, whether it's driving, both. And I just feel like we haven't really had that over the last couple of years, and maybe there's a deeper reason for that, which I guess we could probably do a whole episode on. But I'm not too sure. I don't feel like there's a problem, I guess, the short answer to your question, necessarily. I just think stars don't come along all the time. You don't get a new star every year. That's not a Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc level star. So
that's what makes them special, right? Yeah, it would be boring if every year, God, the grid would be stacked with confrontational but super fast drivers that were.
Well, let's not forget as well that it's very, very ruled by money. I think it costs something like $3 million a year to drive an F2. It's just absolutely outrageous amount of money that you have to spend to get there. So the odds of you both having that money / having the sponsors to pay that money for you, and you're also a Max Verstappen level driver, are very slim, because the money's already taken out 99.9% of the population. I mean, I'd love to try and go into it. There was never in a million years I could have afforded it. So I guess those factors combined means you quite rarely get a driver come through. But anyway, that's enough about four wheels. Should we talk about two?
Let's do it.
That's your love. This is a bit you've been waiting for. We have to get through F1 first to get to it.
Add the vegetables onto the meat.
So just like in F1, we're going to talk about the future. Obviously, we've got a big rule change in MotoGP coming in 2027, which I do want to talk about. I want to know more about it because I don't know too much about it. I'm sure a lot of the listeners don't either, because I think we've got quite a lot of F1 listeners at the moment. But before that, I want to talk about 2026. I don't believe there's any regulation change at all next season. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. And I want to talk about who's potentially gonna do well, which bike's going to do well, which rider's going to do well. And I'll hand over to you. Is there any changes next year, first of all?
No major changes next year. No, the biggie is coming in 27. I don't think there's anything different about the bikes and what they're allowed. To give those teams a bit of extra chance to develop for 27, because it is a dramatic one. The boring answer is that the most likely outcome is that Ducati will still be the best bike. However, I know that a lot of the grid is worried about Honda. Of the teams that have the greatest level of concessions at the moment, so that would be Honda, Yamaha, and KTM. Honda seem to have made the best progress this year. And while everybody will have their 27 project, already, ticking away, and probably Yamaha's V4, for example, is not particularly fast now, but they'll be thinking about how that might adapt for 27. But next season, it feels like Honda's potentially in a sweet spot where they've made the momentum is with them towards the tail end of this season. Both Marini and Mir, I think I was saying to you, maybe it was last week or just on WhatsApp that I don't even remember seeing Luca Marini's helmet for a year and a half. I couldn't pick out his helmet from the crowd because he was just circulating. Well, when he first got on that Honda at the start of last season, he was doing a Pecco Bagnaia. He was 20 seconds off the back.
Doing a Pecco Bagnaia. You knew I was going to enjoy that one. That was brilliant.
So it's been a novelty even to see their helmets and their numbers. But not only that, but coming straight back from a horrific injury at Suzuka in the endurance race, Luca Marini is riding the skin off that Honda and having the form of his life. Joan Mir's got on the podium twice after, again, being really in the doldrums for ages. So the other teams are worried about Honda at the moment. Whether that is enough to topple Ducati, the momentum they've got, the data that they're picking up from 6 bikes rather than Honda's 4, remains to be seen. I'd love to get Yamaha back to the front. I think they're probably a bit more focused on 27 than 26, and something about their season this season seems to have stalled. Fabio's been qualifying brilliantly, but then just sinks like a stone through the race. So Honda look like the most likely movers and shakers next season. Interested to hear your thoughts, though.
Well, I'm interested there. You used the word momentum to describe Ducati. I'm not sure I agree about the word momentum. Obviously, they've won both championships this season, all three championships this season. So, but they've not got the momentum, have they? I mean, like you said, look at Pecco's season. The 2025 bike is arguably not a step forward from 2024. If it is, it's a very small one. Certainly a lot smaller than what they went from the GP23 to the GP24. So, obviously big worries about Pecco, and whatever went wrong this season for Pecco, they'll be worried that's going to repeat again. They certainly in public don't sound like they really fully understand it. Either that or they've been hemmed in by the rules. I think the engine freeze carries over to next year. So if it's an engine issue, then, well, that's locked in now. So I'm not sure I agree, but equally, they're such a good team and not much has changed that I also can't see them suddenly doing a Yamaha and being at the back for sure. Certainly not next year anyway. So, I mean, they could probably run the GP25 and still be in the championship hunt next season without any upgrades. But I agree. I think it's interesting to look at the momentum across this season. KTM are getting there now. They're still not quite there. They've obviously had a lot of financial problems this year. Honda are obviously the massive mover, as you mentioned. Yamaha, I feel like, aren't really moving. Obviously, they're concentrating on making that V4 engine, whether they're thinking about making it an 850cc for 2027, which we'll get onto in a minute. I don't know, but I don't know. Who I missed? Aprilia. And Aprilia also coming on strong the second half of this season. They all started this season, here we go, another Ducati easy win with the Marquez brothers getting a 1-2 every single round comfortably. And now suddenly this end of the season, we're seeing Aprilia sometimes be unstoppable. We're seeing KTM get regular podiums, at least in the hands of one rider. And like you said, the resurgence of Honda. So that's an interesting one. It's a really interesting one. I think if they start next year, how they end this year, we could be in for a really interesting season next season.
It's weird, isn't it? Because we've talked about teams going forward, but it's hard to get a sense of who's actually gone back. I think we're seeing Alex. It's complicated with Yamaha because we're seeing Alex Rins get good results, and again, he's another rider that I didn't see his helmet for most of last year. He's been absolutely ravished by injury. Broke his leg in Mugello. I was there actually for it. Unfortunately, it was horrific, and he's still walking a bit funny from it now. But he's just popped up and started getting pretty decent top 6-7 finishes out of nowhere. I think he is a great rider as well. If you look at the course of his career, he and Fabio are probably making that factory bike look a bit better than it is. By contrast, that Pramac, gorgeous looking bike with the Alpine sponsorship on the fairing, started brilliantly, and Jack Miller has a ride next year because of those first few races, because he was the top Yamaha. So that he showed that I can be the guy that can help you develop this for the next couple of seasons. But after that point, he and Miguel Oliveira have just been invisible. They seem to be the team who's gone backwards, while the others, as you say, like Honda and KTM, have moved forwards. And Aprilia, I don't think they know why they were so fast for a couple of weekends and then nowhere last race. It's a bit like the Pecco situation. There seems to be something about the bikes at the moment that it's so complex. Maybe the pace of development has actually outpaced the engineers' understanding of how to set them up and why particular rider feedback leads to certain outcomes, because I think Aprilia is probably just as baffled about their Ralph Fernandez winning a race and then going, "Oh, I forgot I'm Ralph Fernandez. I'll finish P14 again next weekend. Sorry about that, everyone."
He crashed, actually, I think. Yeah. Crazy. I want to talk more specifically about Honda, because you mentioned there that teams are worried about them, and I've kind of read the same sort of rumours that they're genuinely a bit like, wow. But just because they may have found, I don't know what they found, let's say they found a second season on season, doesn't mean they're going to be able to find another second season on season necessarily. There's going to be a law of diminishing returns there naturally. It's easy to find a time when someone else has shown you where the time is, effectively. So why is it that they're supposedly so fearsome or feared, I guess, by other teams? Do you know why it is?
Well, they're a sleeping giant. They're, as Repsol Honda, they're the most successful team in MotoGP history. So, and I don't know to what extent they've scaled down after Marquez left and losing the Repsol sponsorship. You would imagine the financial repercussions of that would be significant, but the heritage is there, the expertise is there. I think the ambition is there. It's still absolutely, that HRC project is crucial for Honda. It sells them bikes. So there's no question of them lacking commitment to getting back to the front of the grid. And they're also achieving this with the greatest will in the world to Luca Marini and Joan Mir. They're achieving this sort of hype with two riders who, I think, even with Joan Mir being a world champion, you would say they're probably not among the top 5 fastest riders on the grid. So if you did have Marquez going back onto that Honda, what might he achieve? If you could turn Fabio Quartararo's head or get Pedro Acosta onto that factory Honda, what might they achieve on it if they managed to, again, just find an extra 10th rather than an extra second from year to year? So that's probably why there's a bit of fear factor about the sleeping giant.
So that's teams. And then obviously we've got the Marc Marquez effect, which hopefully he can get back to full fitness. He's obviously not racing the rest of the season to it sounds like they're making good noises, but they also kept making good noises when he was injured for many years. So hopefully he's okay. Let's assume he's back to the same fitness he had this year, next year. I'll ask this a simple question. Which bikes in the field next year do you think he couldn't win the championship on? We know he's a factory category rider next year. It's not going to happen. But if he can win on almost any bike, then it doesn't really matter the bike form, because if he's going to win no matter what. So do you think there's any teams in the grid that he couldn't win a championship on? I mean, surely Yamaha.
It's a good question. I think specifically the KTM seems to... So I think Acosta and Marquez are really similar riders, except Marquez has obviously learned to look after his tyres within, about 3 races of his rookie season. And Acosta is still like, going backwards. What's going on? Thought I was on for a podium here. But they both like a very, very lively bike. And I think the reason Acosta, I think he's 40 races into his MotoGP career now and without a victory, which I don't think anybody saw coming. Looking all the way through his Moto3 and Moto2 days, his stock was so high, it felt like he could be the guy who could beat some of Marquez's records in terms of, fewest races before the victory, youngest ever race winner. That hasn't happened because the KTM, I think, is not very good at being, chucked around and getting a lot of sideways movement. I think it's difficult. Mark doesn't really ride that Ducati in that way. He doesn't ride it like he rode the Honda. That's the only bike that makes me think, would they gel with the design philosophy of it? Maybe he could. I think Fabio on the Yamaha, what the commentators always said is that he makes up all his time on the brakes and then he gets overtaken on the straights again, but he focuses on very late braking and carrying corner speed. That Yamaha chassis has always been brilliant at just taking flowing lines and carrying way more corner speed than everyone else. Marquez could probably adapt to that. I think it would be a bike whose aero package is so restricting that he can't apply his feel and his intuition to it, and maybe that would be the KTM. But of course, I'm talking out of my arse. What do you think?
Well, obviously, I'm a Mark fan, so I'll put that asterisk on there straight away. I don't know. It's interesting. I look, to answer the question simply, I don't think he could win on a Yamaha, because I agree. I do rate Fabio Quartararo very highly. He's doing things on that bike that 3 other riders just cannot get anywhere near, especially in quali. So I don't think he can do it on a Yamaha. I don't know. I also rate Pedro Acosta very highly, but I think he might suit that KTM. I think he could wrestle that KTM to some solid podiums. I think certainly Aprilia, with the form it's shown in the second half of this season, I think he could be champion on that. And then Honda, I think, again, with Honda's promise, I think he's got a chance to be champion on that. I do. But equally, this is assuming the form book is going to look similar to what it looks now. If suddenly next season the Ducati sorts their life out and the GP26 is incredible, we saw what Mark did last year on the GP23 versus GP24. He still managed to win a couple of races because he's Mark, and he still did unbelievably well. But there was no chance to win the championship. Even if you take out the first maybe 6-10 races of him adapting to the bike, which he eventually did very well. Even the second half of the season, I don't think he probably was able to outscore either Pecco or Jorge Martin. So, assuming it's as close as it is now, I think Mark could win on every bike bar the Yamaha. I would say next season, but that's me being a Marc Marquez fan, so it'll be interesting. But I do think the fact that Ducati have got Mark next season, they're winning the Riders' title, surely. And if he can do anything like he did this season, probably the Constructors' title. And assuming that the other Ducatis are pretty decent as well, like they have been this season, probably also the Manufacturers' title. I think, as you said, Ducati are the shoe-in. They have to be. They're the dominant force. There's no major rule changes next season. But again, I guess time will tell. I keep saying that, but we are talking about the future here, and realistically, we don't know.
Yeah, I think it'll be really, really telling for Aprilia when Jorge Martin gets back on that bike next season. Hopefully, he's at full health. Will he be able to adapt to it as quickly as Bez has this season? Because I think Bez's season has been absolutely incredible. Like, that's his first season on this new bike. Not just going from, a GP23 to a 24, but an entirely new manufacturer. And he was nowhere for the first few races. And then he has looked like the second best performer. Maybe that's been a bit harsh than Alex Marquez. I would sort of tend to forget about Alex Marquez. He's on a really good bike. He's a Marquez brother. I sort of take it for granted that he's really fast this year. But on that, in an entirely new factory environment, for Bez to have adapted that quickly. If Martin can do the same, then the bike is great. And maybe it's the best bike on the grid. Maybe it's better than the Ducati already. If he doesn't, then Bez is an absolutely generational talent to a degree that we didn't really notice. And he kind of went missing last season on the VR46. So that would be really interesting.
Is Jorge Martin overhyped because we didn't have a Marquez or a Acosta fighting for that championship the last couple of years? We had Pecco, who this season has obviously been made to look very average. I do think he's better than he has been this season, but still, I think we can probably agree, even though you're a Pecco fan, that Pecco isn't on the level of Mark. That's not to mean he can't necessarily beat him across the season. I don't think Rosberg was on the level of Hamilton either, and yet he still beat him across the season. So maybe Jorge Martin's overhyped, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I like him a lot. I think he's a good talent, but we haven't. That was why it was such a shame that Mark was injured for so long, because we didn't really have that amazing talent that we had as a benchmark, like we had with Rossi for all those years as well. And even the people that were able to compete with Rossi, like, Lorenzo and people like that, we just never really had that. So I do think Martin's a good rider. Is he better than Quartararo? We don't know. Is he better than Acosta? We don't know. We just haven't got enough data at the moment on these guys to be able to really know how good they really are. They're obviously decent, but are they Pecco decent or are they Mark decent? Because those are not the same things.
I agree. I think with Martin, I don't want to kick a guy while he's down, and I obviously, wish him a speedy return to full health, and I would like to see him back at the front. He's a very likable character. He's a deserving world champion, but like I said last episode, it feels like an accounting quirk that he won that world championship because he was really, really good at winning sprints. Pecco Bagnaia won 11 races, 11 Grand Prix last year, and didn't win the championship because Martin was unbeatable at sprints.
Does Pecco hand you a little note just for these podcasts? Just a little backhanded note of like, can you bring up those 11 wins again?
Make sure you win. Make sure you mention those 11. People do forget because, it's just very strange championship to look back on last season. And Pecco did make his mistakes. Martin is a deserving winner, but it feels a bit like that Joan Mir World Championship where everyone around him was too busy crashing or having their engines re-homologated because they'd been naughty in Yamaha's case. And so Joan Mir was like, oh, brilliant, there's no one around, I guess I'll take the championship then. It was a bit like that with Martin. He just identified that, like, no one else has figured out the sprints yet. I guess I'll go win them all, and then whatever happens in the Grand Prix. So it's possible that he's overhyped. He needs to prove himself, I think. Like Pecco, I'll concede that much. Both those riders who were kind of being billed as great rivals, they both have to do more in their career to prove that they're in the same pantheon as Pedrosa, Rossi, Marquez, etc. It doesn't help when people like Pedrosa turn up as wildcards and they go, oh yeah, MotoGP. I remember now, I'll finish fourth.
Yeah, it's easy, yeah. Crazy. Yeah, I mean, all right, one more question on this for you. Next season, we obviously have largely not really got a major rule change, right? So I think if Mark beats Pecco next season, that's one thing. But we can all go, okay, but it's the same rule set, yada, maybe it was the engine all wrong. If Mark also handily beats, and I don't mean dominates like he has done this season, but let's assume that both those factory Ducati riders stay. If Mark handily beats Pecco, let's say Hamilton and Bottas sort of level, so that like Pecco's decent, but like he's never going to win a championship against this guy. If that happens the next two seasons, what is your thoughts on Pecco in this theoretical situation? So we're talking about the current rules and the new rules, complete reset. In theory, whatever's going on with Pecco right now, hopefully would be sorted.
If he still doesn't manage to win championships, then I think that does affect his standing in the pantheon. I do get the sense that Pecco, it's kind of why I like him as well. He's a bit like Viñales in that, in perfect, they call him perfect Pecco. In the right conditions, when everything is just so and he's had his favourite breakfast and his hair's looking good, he can get on that bike and nobody can ride with him. If something's slightly off with the setup, as was often the case on Friday practice and into quali and in the sprint race on Saturday, they hadn't dialed in that setup. He'd often, even during his championship winning years, he'd be languishing out of the top 10 in practice. During the sprints, he was still kind of working on things and they'd focus on the Grand Prix. So if something isn't dialed in properly, he's not able to be perfect Pecco. And of course, we've seen this year that he hasn't been able to dial it in over the course of the weekend. He runs out of time. The sprint is an absolute disaster. The Grand Prix is often the same.
Just a quick note on that. Let's not forget as well, part of the reason that Pecco was able to win those 11 races last year was because of that. The sprint, he wasn't quite ready to set up, not very happy. Oh, look, that's what Jorge's running. Okay, I'll try that or whatever. Just still evolves it. That's why. It's not because, he's a better rider than Jorge or anything like that. It's, like you said, that's almost a negative, that it took him that long to get to the point of actually being decent.
Well, I've heard that theory as well, that it basically just waited to see what Jorge would do with setup, and then being the factory team, they had access to that data, and they would just, copy and paste Martin's setup onto the bike for Sunday, and then he'd go and win it. I don't think there's any basis for that, actually. I don't think nobody's ever corroborated that. I think it's supposition that would be an advantage that the factory team would have. They get to have everybody's telemetry data. Would Martin's setup even really work for Pecco? Maybe. Could might it identify something they've done wrong? Maybe, but I've got to go to bat for Pecco there again. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that's just a bit of MotoGP folklore from last season that's become, taken as read. But I concede your point. I think he does have more to prove. And if he if he can't find a way to beat the best, right now this season Marquez has proven that he's a rider for the ages. Coming back from injury, riding a very different style of bike in a really different era than he was last dominant in. He's always been competitive even when he's riding around with one working shoulder. He was last dominant in 2019 when only really the Ducati had those front wings on. So it's incredible to see how he's adapted. If you can't beat that rider on that form, then you won't go down in history as being his equal, unfortunately. And I think that goes for everybody else as well. So they've got one more chance, the next couple of seasons, 26 and 27, to prove themselves against Marquez. Otherwise, they risk looking a bit a weaker generation than the previous one.
That's a really good way of putting it. That's a good conclusion. Speaking of 2027 then, obviously we've got the massive rules overhaul. I think I know most of it, but you will definitely know more on me on this. So do you want to take us through the changes that are going to happen to the MotoGP regulations for 2027?
Yeah, so I think the overarching philosophy for this is that the tracks are running out of space. The bikes are getting too fast. There's no more space to push the runoff areas further back. There's nothing that they can do with the barriers to make them safer. If they carry on like this, they will stop having to go to places like Jerez, for example, which is a real heartland. All the
Spanish people in the chat just died. Anyone who's listened to that.
Jerez. There you
Jerez.
go. Jerez, mate. Un cerveza, por favor. They won't be able to attend Jerez. That would be a real shame. There's a few other places like Phillip Island, I think, as well, where the footprint of the track is what it is, and they can't make it any bigger. So, in a way, this is an attempt to slow the bikes down. It's also promoting better racing, because there has been some conversation about MotoGP going, in a derogatory way in the direction of Formula One. If it's about aero development, then it's very, very expensive. It's not a level playing field to develop a good bike. And it also means that it's harder to follow in a rider's wake because they're disturbing the air in front of you, and harder to overtake. So with all of that in mind, the engines are getting smaller. That's probably the top line, is they're reducing the engine size from 1000cc as it currently stands to 850s. Their minimum weight has also been reduced slightly from 157 to 153 kilos. And ride height devices are banned outright. There's a slightly reduced fuel capacity, a switch to 100% sustainable fuel. And there are also some rules regarding the aero parts. So there's a box that the aero parts need to fit in. So basically, they need to be a bit smaller, a bit narrow as you look front onto the bike. It's a set of rule changes. The reaction to it has been, does it go far enough towards achieving what we want, which is closer racing again? And we don't want another situation like Suzuki going, we just can't afford to, or we don't have any appetite to develop aero because it doesn't have a road bike application. So we're off. I'm not sure that it goes far enough. There have been some very vocal critics, including Casey Stoner, who is the most vocal of all the critics when it comes to anything MotoGP and Dorna and FIM. And he thinks that, realistically, we won't see that much difference in terms of how the bikes race in 27. And it may not even solve the issue of, will the bikes be safe? Will they be going slowly enough for us to still race at places like Jerez? Or even go back to, it'd be great to go to Laguna Seca that we used to go to 15 plus years ago. Some brilliant battles there. Stoner and Rossi through that corkscrew chicane, but the track is the size of the track. It can't go any further back, and eventually the bikes outgrew it. So time will tell. There's also, mentioning the engine capacity going down to 850. it brings back a darker era of MotoGP, the 800s era, which is not very fondly remembered at all. The racing wasn't very good. It coincided with Rossi getting on the Ducati. So, the biggest star in the sport was just sort of languishing and crashing all the time. And no one remembers the 800s era very fondly. There's nothing really in these rules that suggest that the racing will be anything like that. That it will fall into the same traps as that previous era. But it's always a bit of a shame, isn't it, to hear that the premier category of any motorsport is getting lesser in some way, and the engines are getting smaller. So, I don't know what you think about that.
I'm not sure I agree with that last sentiment. I think, 1 litre bikes obviously very common in on road, but I mean, as we start to get more and more power out of the same engine capacity, who needs a litre bike on the road? An 850cc on the road is probably enough. So I think that potentially has got plenty of road relevance there. So I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, yeah, the way you look at it, we've got to slow them down a bit because they're going too quickly, sounds bad. But like you said, at the end of the day, the MotoGP can't run on like a street circuit or whatever, or have the barriers too close because people will die. Like, it's still a sport. We've got to be safe. And if it's a choice between, hey, let's only run at circuits with the biggest runoff areas in the world, or let's change the bikes a little bit so we can run on any circuit, like you said, so we can keep Jerez and places like that. Phillippi and Jerez are two fantastic circuits. It'd be such a shame to lose them. I guarantee you people will moan more about losing great circuits like that than they would about the bikes being a little bit slower. But there's always resistance to change. We as humans, particularly British humans, don't like change very much. So there's always vocal opposition to it, no matter what it is. But I think the biggest issue is probably aero, really. And well, I say aero, I don't know exactly what it is, but the fact that bikes can't follow as closely as they once could, and the fact that the front tyre pressures are completely wrong. I don't know if there's any changes planned for the front tyre pressure stuff, but that's the negative MotoGP right now. If they need to be a bit slower, fine. But other than that, like, they can follow reasonably closely, but it's too hard to overtake. So you need them to follow closely, and you need them to not cook their tyre or get a stupid penalty that no one can see for tyre pressure. That's the things that need fixing, in my opinion. You shook your head when I mentioned tyre pressures there. Does that mean there's currently no planned changes for the tyre pressure rules?
No. Yeah, it needs addressing. It really does. I agree with that. I think where it doesn't go far enough for me is they banned ride height devices. That's one step down a road that includes reducing the electronic aids, in a really broad way to get the power and the control of the bike back in the rider's hand rather than in the engineer's hand. I think that's also affecting the quality of the racing because you're not really seeing riders on the edge as much as we did. They're still committing just as much as ever, but it's not as visceral. It was so easy to wheelie out of a corner before. Now the aero is, that wing is absolutely planting even before you apply the ride height device. It was easy to high side. Again, no one wants to see high sides and horrible accidents, but it was quite cool to see people just like squirreling their way, snaking out of a corner because they put down the power a little bit too early and then they were controlling it. That was very exciting to watch, and it meant that when a rider was putting a move in, you knew that all of the power of that bike was in their hands. And now I think all of the electronic aids are mitigating that a little bit. And, Casey Stoner's line is, I don't know if he was specifically referring to these rule changes, but in criticism of the modern version of the sport, was that we're making champions out of engineers rather than riders. I think probably a lot of people would like to see that addressed. And banning ride height devices is like a bit of a token gesture towards that, but I don't think it goes far enough. It would also be very interesting to see, going back to the Bagnaia Marquez conversation, if you took away the electronic aids, what would that do to the hierarchy of riders? Who would come to the fore? Maybe someone like Fabio or Pedro would really benefit from that.
I think the engineer criticism is very lazy. I think it's a good headline. And it's an easy thing to criticise MotoGP for on the face of it. In reality, look at the years, 15, maybe 20 years ago, when like Yamaha were dominating. You're not telling me that they were only dominating because they had the two best riders and their bike was the same as everybody else's. Hell no, they had the best bike because they had the best engineers. It's not new. That's welcome to motor racing. You need a good car underneath you or machine underneath you in whatever form that is in order to perform well. I don't think that's new. That doesn't mean it's not necessarily relying a bit more on engineers now, but that almost implies that, it used to be anyone could win on any bike and now you can't, which does, that sounds like that sucks. It's just not true. So yeah, I think banning of ride heights, I think that's a good change. I agree with a reduction in age for the riders, but I also think it kind of needs to be road relevant. I think, who cares about horse racing anymore? Who cares who's the best horse and the fastest jockey? I know it exists. I'm aware horse racing still exists. In fact, I'm moving to Cheltenham soon, so I very much know it exists.
Oh, yeah.
But most people don't care. Like 98% of the population don't care about horses and horse racing and whatever that is. Car racing is much more popular than horse racing, and it's because it's relevant. It's what you drive. Even if F1 cars look nothing like your car, it's still a car with 4 wheels and a steering wheel and without traction control, yada, yada, yada. So I think with MotoGP, I think road relevance is important. But equally, most road bikes these days, most road bikes have got traction control and ABS and all these things that come with it. So actually, I don't mind traction control and ABS. I wouldn't hate ABS, to be fair. I don't think it would change things materially, excessively, but it would take a bit of skill away from the riders, I suppose. But I think it's interesting regardless. If you literally gave all of the riders the same road bike, I know they contractually they couldn't all ride a Ducati, Panigale, whatever that road bike's called. But if you gave them all the same, with the traction control, with the ABS, with the same tyres, it'd be fascinating to see who come out on top. And yet you've given them a bike that's not on the limit. You've given them a bike with all these aids and stuff. So I agree with banning the ride height devices because I think the bikes should be able to follow closely, and maybe ride height devices aren't as road relevant because they're too dangerous. We've also seen crashes directly caused by ride height devices. We've seen DNFs caused directly by ride height devices. I think that's a good change. I wonder about the aero. The problem is obviously you can't unlearn things once you've learnt it, so you can't really just ban aero. Hopefully they've reduced it enough so that they can follow closer, and then you come back to the tyre pressure rules. Because for me, that's the only issue. I'm not worried about it being too engineer focused. I'm not worried about the aids particularly that they've got. I think we still see the best riders come to the fore, so clearly it's not a massive issue. Unlike F1 more so, which is, although you still see someone like Verstappen come to the fore, I think these days someone like a Senna figure can't make the difference that they once could. I think you still can in MotoGP. So yeah, I don't know. I agree. I wonder if it has gone far enough. I guess I gotta say it again. Time will tell because we just don't know at the end of the day. Look, I'm a fan of modern MotoGP. I really like this year. I like last year. I like the year before it. I'm a huge fan of MotoGP. I really, really love it. However, I do still look back at clips when, it was at Barcelona, I don't know what year it was, Lorenzo versus Rossi.
2009, yeah.
2009, oh my God. I've got goosebumps thinking about it. That last lap was ridiculous. Ascending to the final corner at Barcelona, are you insane? You would not be able to do that these days. And if you did, you would probably take both of you out of the race and P3 would win.
Yeah.
That just doesn't exist in MotoGP anymore. And the reason I said I like modern MotoGP is because I don't look back at Rose Tinted classes. I recognise that was a great era. I did watch MotoGP then, but I love current MotoGP. However, I still think that was better because they were able to follow that much more closely. It was so much more about the rider rather than the aero and the tyre pressures, etc.
Well, firstly, I think the estate of John McCrewick is going to be absolutely furious with your savage takedown of horse racing. So if the episode is taken down promptly after publication, then that's probably why.
Well, look, I don't know who that is, so that probably tells you all you need to know.
John McCrewick was the Channel 4 racing presenter. We're going down a real rabbit hole here. Very distinctive man with a deerstalker hat. And did you know he used to watch the racing? Was it called the Racing Line on Channel 4? I think that's a real hit across the broadside to horse racing, and we'll pay for that in the comments, I'm sure. But I think from Casey Stoner's perspective, he was at the peak of his powers during exactly that era, around 2009. And he's probably looking at these modern bikes and thinking, I had to exact so much more skill onto my bike then to achieve what I did than these riders do now. And that makes me quite bitter. Now, Stoner as well, famously retired very early. He was sick of the politics. There's also I don't know whether he had chronic fatigue syndrome as well, but I think definitely there was a physical toll that it took on him. So, I
think you're right. I remember reading that, yeah.
He retired after something like 120 races, whereas, the performances that he put in would have warranted 300-400 race career. So there's probably an element of him looking at how comparatively easier and safer it is. I don't think anyone would begrudge a sport getting safer, but thinking about how much he risked, how much he put on the line, and the amount of concentration and training and practice and skill that he had to put into every corner, and going, it's not the same as it was. These current lot just don't understand. So I think maybe that's his perspective.
I think that's a very, main character energy way of looking at that. Because who's to say that Fabio Quartararo isn't putting in the exact effort that Casey Stoner did back in the day? Everyone's had underperforming machinery that you have to try and outperform and override to get on top of it. I don't think that's... I don't know. I respect his opinion to some extent, but I just think everyone's got their own... I'm not going to say motives, but their own points of view, their own ways of looking at things, just as we have. Yeah, I don't know. I personally don't really recognise. I don't agree with that criticism personally. But yeah, I mean, look, like I said, I do like 2009 era. So if it goes a bit more back to that, bit more about the riders, bit closer following, then I'll be happy. But I'm going to say it one more time. Time will tell. Time will tell on that one. But just finally then, rounding out, you want to talk a bit about Moto2 and Moto3 riders. And I am, just as I am with horse racing, completely out my depth with this because I couldn't name you a single rider from Moto2 and Moto3, which would probably shock you because you could probably name pretty much all of them. So come on, hit us with it. Who are the riders to watch from Moto2 and Moto3 as we go into the next year or two?
Well, I'd like to start by just making the case for it as a thing to watch in the first place, and why it's important that there are, there are these feeder categories, because I think actually the racing in Moto3 should be the reference point. It is extraordinary. There are two manufacturers. There's a KTM bike and a Honda. There's very little in it between them in terms of lap time. They're really homologated bikes. Nobody can really develop them. The Leopard Honda team seem to find a way of working with the Honda supplier and extracting really, really marginal gains. But generally, everyone's on the same bike. And that means there's a bit of Formula E, slipstreaming focus to it. There's also riders going 4 or 5 abreast into corners. It's just such an entertaining product. And you really see a rider's character when they turn up in Moto3 and they're, 18 years old and hot-headed and have yet to temper some of their wilder tendencies on the track. It leads to incredible racing. Moto2, it's a bigger bike. It's similar to MotoGP. The racing is closer to MotoGP than Moto3, but you also have a lot of young riders with everything to prove and that will do anything to hit MotoGP. So I would recommend anybody who enjoys a MotoGP race, just give the Moto3 and the Moto2 race a go on a given weekend, and even without knowing the stories, the riders, the subplots, you will find something probably pretty spectacular.
I think, just to jump in there quickly, I think the reason I don't is because, first of all, just time. It's a lot, especially if it's F1 on as well. It's just a lot of stuff to watch. I think MotoGP, especially having the sprint now, kind of ticks my box, bike racing-wise, typically on a weekend. So if I had the Moto2 and Moto3 race into that, it is a lot. I would also add, you mentioned about 4 wide and stuff. I just think sometimes, though, that can be a bit, almost it's kind of like, the two words I've got in my head are amateurish and fake. Neither of those are the right word. But do you know what I mean? Because it's so much about slipstream that, of course, they're 4 wide because you can't break away because it's so much about slipstream. So that, to me, lessens the racing. It'd be a bit like me going, karting and claiming that karting is almost as good as F1. I'm not necessarily saying you're saying Moto3 is good as MotoGP. But karting, okay, sometimes you're 4 wide or whatever. Sometimes there's contact and it's more dramatic. But actually, F1's way better. They're different levels. So that's, personally, for Moto3 in particular, not a big fan of it, but I also haven't given it a fair chance, if I'm completely honest. I've seen clips and stuff, of course, but I've never sat down and watched an entire race. Moto2, I think, is, as you say, closer to MotoGP. I could see myself potentially getting into that a bit more, but equally, again, I've never given it a chance. Just to give you kind of an idea of why it's not just that I just haven't or can't be asked. It's there is actual reasons there, whether rightly or wrongly, but that's my logic for why I don't currently watch it. But I will give it a go. I'll give it a go for you.
I thoroughly recommend it. The first rider that I'd like to talk about, one of the most interesting storylines of this year has been Manu Gonzalez, Moto2 rider who was walking away with that Moto2 championship the first half of the season, and it looked an absolutely foregone conclusion that he would be champion. It also looked a foregone conclusion that he would get a MotoGP ride based off the back of those performances, and that hasn't happened. primarily because of his Spanish passport. So the MotoGP grid is very, very Spanish dominated, and that makes it all the harder if you're a Spanish rider to find your way into one of those teams, because the sponsorship opportunities, it's just from a marketing perspective, from marketing the sport as a global product, it's just not desirable. So teams are more likely to go for any other rider who isn't Italian or Spanish. So Manu Gonzalez didn't get that offer. So the only thing to play for this season was the championship. His form just started to drop off at the worst time. And Diogo Moreira, Brazilian rider, who didn't win in Moto3, but has just been consistently pretty good until this point, has had a really breakout season. And he has earned that LCR Honda ride out of nowhere. And he's also in real danger of winning the Moto2 championship this year. So he's kind of about to take everything from Manu Gonzalez. Gonzalez will be in Moto2 next year, and he will be looking to, pave the road for his ascendancy into MotoGP. But he may be doing it not as a world champion. It may be that Moreira's taken everything from him. So it'll be fascinating to see how he responds to that. So in Moto2, that's who I'd like to showcase. There's also Isan Guevara, who's a rider I'm a little bit obsessed with, because I remember watching him in Moto3 in 2021 and finding him a really there's something about that kid, he's going to go places. And it was the first time that I've got that right, because in 22 he was the Moto3 world champion and had a really dominant Lorenzo-like season where he actually broke the pack. It's really difficult to just go off and do your own thing from the front in Moto3, because as you say, it's really easy to follow behind in someone's wake, and generally you have a pack race. But Guevara just dominated. He moved up to Moto3 in 2023. This is now his third season. He's really, really, really struggled. The first season he struggled to get into the points. He did have a couple of breakout performances, a top 5 in Phillip Island. Slow progress through last season, but he didn't look like a world champion that was going to just tick his way up through the categories and then into MotoGP. And there was, question marks about whether he would get a ride this year. He landed on his feet with the Pramac Blue Crew team. So it's basically Pramac MotoGP team's feeder category. It's him and Tony Arbolino. Arbolino is a very established rider with a lot of pedigree and goodwill towards him. And Guevara, out of nowhere, has become the team leader and has been getting a lot of top 10s, top 5 finishes. He got back on the podium. He did achieve a podium last season, but it was a bit of a weird one because Jake Dixon, I think, counted the laps wrong or something. So his teammate in front of him gave up on the straight ahead of him, and he inherited, third from fourth. This season, he got the podium on merit. He did still get an extra. He got a second over a third because Manu Gonzalez got a tyre pressure penalty. Actually, I don't think it was tyre pressure. I think it was a non-homologated ECU or something like that. But Guevara's story has been fascinating because he's finally starting to come good. He's getting some momentum behind him. And if he manages to put together a championship run, he'll still face the Spanish passport problem, but it will be a real story of vindication for him, because I think the grid had kind of given up on him when he first got into Moto2. There's also Deniz Oncu. So he's a young Turkish rider who trains with that same stable as Toprak. And so he rides like Toprak. He's an acrobat, a gymnast on that bike. He's been out injured, unfortunately, for certainly the back half of this season, but he got a few wins together and looked like he might be, in with a shout for the championship in only his second season in Moto2. He's also a real character. I remember one particular Moto3 race where I think he had a dead leg for some reason, so he's racing around in first, about to win his first Moto3 race, and on the straights, he's just punching his leg because he's either trying to get the blood circulating to it or something, who knows, but he's a very animated, interesting guy. And quickly on Moto3, first of all, the incident that we spoke about last week involving Rueda and Noah Detwiller. Both riders are now okay, so Detwiller is no longer in critical condition. Don't know, health-wise, realistically when he'll be back riding a bike again, but it's great to hear that he's no longer in intensive care. Rueda, came off better out of that collision. I think he has some fractures in his hand, but wasn't too bad. Rueda's had a really class season. He moves up to Moto2 next year. He has it all to prove, but he's looked the class of the field this year. The other rider is David Munoz, who is like probably the dirtiest rider in all three categories, but has managed to just about temper that anger. He's been out injured this last few races because Adrian Fernandez, another particularly aggressive racer, kind of run him off the track. He kind of got his, his just desserts back at, was it Thailand? Maybe it was Singapore. But if he manages to like control his temper a little bit, he'll be one to watch as he moves up into Moto2 next season. So those are the highlights of the junior categories, and I thoroughly recommend watching some of those races next season.
Well, you know what? I'll give it a go this weekend. How about that? We got Portugal and MotoGP this weekend, which is a fantastic bike race circuit. I absolutely love it. So I'll give it a go this weekend. I'll give both a go this weekend, and I'll report back next week. And of course, in F1, we've got the Brazilian Grand Prix as well. So a couple of races to go at this coming weekend, which we'll be talking about this time next week, of course. And I'm not going to lie, I will forget all of those names you just said. But maybe when I watch it, I'm like, oh, yeah, actually, no, I remember now. Phil
I'll
said
WhatsApp
this.
you.
So,
yeah.
It'll give me a test next week.
Yeah.
See if I really watched it. But anyway, guys, that's enough from us here at Downforce Debrief. Hopefully you enjoyed the podcast. Still considering a name change, I don't know, Downforce. We just need to go with a name that's actually like a banger of a name. We're still thinking about it. We're not too sure. We're not being won over by any particular, but Downforce Debrief isn't a bad name for now anyway. But yeah, drop a follow, guys, if you haven't already. Even if we do change our name in the future, it'll be all the same channel, so the follow will carry over regardless if we change our name or not. But I hope you guys enjoyed listening along today. And as I said, we will catch you next week for a debrief on the upcoming Brazilian and Portuguese Grand Prix. Catch you then, guys.